All right, welcome to Modern Josephus. I'm going to go ahead today and react to Crash Course U.S. History, and it's focused on slavery. So, there might be disagreements that I actually have here, but first I want to say that slavery was evil. It's not something that... okay. So there's different types of slavery. Chattel slavery, which is what we're going to be talking about, was evil. It's kidnapping people, forcing them into labor, making money off of them. There's actually a Bible verse in Exodus chapter 22, I believe, verse 14 or 15, something like that, maybe 16, that says that anyone who is found to have captured someone and sold them was to be put to death. So that's from the Bible in Exodus. Chattel slavery, what happened in the U.S., was a moral wrong, a moral issue. And many of the founding fathers knew this, and many of them worked hard to end it. However, they had to reach a compromise with some of the, especially the deep South states like South Carolina, Georgia, and they reached a compromise over slavery in order to form a nation. Should they have done more? Yes. Could they have done more? If South Carolina and Georgia had been more willing to do more, they could have done more, but that's not how history worked out. So we'll go ahead and get into this, and let's see what we got.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about slavery, which is not funny. Yeah, so we put a lay on the eagle to try to cheer you up, but let's face it, this is going to be depressing. With slavery, every time you think like, oh, it couldn't have been that bad, it turns out to have been much worse. Mr. Green, but what about... Yeah, me from the past. I'm going to stop you right there because you're going to embarrass yourself. Slavery was hugely important to America. I mean, it led to a civil war, and it also lasted what, at least in U.S. history, counts as a long-ass time, from 1619 to 1864.
Yes, it did last in America for a long time. But it lasted all over the world. Okay, I mean, the United States compared to, let's say, any North African country, it was a lot shorter time. Compared to many countries, it was a lot shorter time. Now, compared to England, maybe it was longer. Compared to France, it was longer. But compared to almost every civilization in the world, it was way short. It was shorter, one of the shortest.
Fine. And yes, I know there's a 1,200-year-old church in your neighborhood in Denmark, but we're not talking about Denmark. But slavery is most important because we still struggle with its legacy. So yes, today's episode will probably not be funny, but it will be important. So the slave-based economy in the South is sometimes characterized as having been separate from the market revolution, but that's not really the case. Without Southern cotton, the North wouldn't have been able to industrialize, at least not as quickly, because cotton textiles were one of the first industrially produced products and the most important commodity in world trade by the 19th century. And 3/4 of the world's cotton came from the American South. And speaking of cotton, why has no one mentioned to me that my collar has been half popped this entire episode like I'm trying to...
The thing is that with the market revolution, there was a lot more than just a textile industry. All right? The North had other industries too, not just the textile. And actually, most of the cotton that the South produced went to England. That's why they try to get England on their side. That's why they try to get France on their side. I don't talk about the Confederacy. They try to get those two countries on their side, thinking that, well, since we're not providing them with the cotton, they're going to come over to us. The United States the North was fine without cotton. They were fine without cotton. They didn't need cotton. That's why they won the war without having cotton. The textile industry in the North, it may have been big, but there were other industries besides the textile industry in the North.
To recreate the flying nun's hat. And although there were increasingly fewer slaves in the North as northern states outlawed slavery, cotton shipments overseas made northern merchants rich. Northern banks.
I don't get that. The cotton wasn't shipped out of New York. The cotton was shipped out of New Orleans. It was shipped out of Charleston. So the merchants in Charleston and the merchants in New Orleans were making a profit off of cotton, but you'd have to show me if New York shipped cotton. Did Boston ship cotton? Boston was known mostly for their whaling. New York was just a financial center. But I want to know how much cotton left in New York and Boston, because those were the two biggest ports, and Philadelphia. Now maybe Philadelphia, I'd believe you more, but you'd have to tell me more about that, because from what I know, from what I've read, most of the cotton was shipped out of the South, never went up north. It would be kind of weird for cotton to go from South Carolina to New York to be shipped out. When you have Charleston, South Carolina right there, you got a port. I need that connection. If you have that connection, if he doesn't provide it and you have that connection, a website or something, an article, put it down in the comments.
Bankers financed the purchase of land for plantations. Northern insurance companies insured slaves who were, after all, considered property and very valuable property.
I need to read this. Okay, I don't see anything.
Very valuable
like that.
property.
Okay.
And in addition to turning cotton into cloth for sale overseas, northern manufacturers sold cloth back to the South, where it was used to clothe the very slaves who had cultivated it.
So the North bought the textiles from England. That's what I'm kind of hearing.
But certainly the most prominent effects of the slave-based economy were seen in the South. The profitability of slave-based agriculture, especially king cotton, meant that the South would remain largely agricultural and rural. Slave states were home to a few cities, like St. Louis and Baltimore, but with the exception of New Orleans, almost all southern urbanization took place in the upper South, further away from the large cotton plantations. And slave-based agriculture was so profitable that it siphoned money away from other economic endeavors. Like, there was very little industry in the South. It produced only 10% of the nation's manufactured goods, and as most of the capital was being plowed into the purchase of slaves, there was very little room for technological innovation, like, for instance, railroads. This lack of industry and railroads would eventually make the South suck at the Civil War.
So the South was actually poor due to slavery, not wealthy.
Thankfully. In short, slavery dominated the South, shaping it both economically and culturally. And slavery wasn't a minor aspect of American society. By 1860, there were 4 million slaves in the U.S., and in the South, they made up 1/3 of the total population. Although in the popular imagination, most plantations were these sprawling affairs with hundreds of slaves, in reality, the majority of slaveholders owned 5 or fewer slaves. And of course, most white people in the South owned no slaves at all, although if they could afford to, they would sometimes rent slaves to help with their work. These were the so-called yeoman farmers who lived self-sufficiently, raised their own food, and purchased very little in the market economy. They worked the poorest land, and as a result, were mostly pretty poor themselves. But even they largely supported slavery, partly perhaps for aspirational reasons, and partly because the racism inherent to the system gave even the poorest whites legal and social status. And Southern intellectuals worked hard to encourage these ideas of white solidarity and to make the case for slavery. Many of the founders, a bunch of whom you'll remember held slaves, saw slavery as a necessary evil. Jefferson once wrote, quote, "As it is, we have the wolf by the ear, and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale and self-preservation in the other." The belief...
And this is where once we get around closer to the time of the Confederacy or to the Civil War, you see a very distinctive view of slavery from the Founding Fathers, where the Founding Fathers saw it as a quote-unquote necessary evil. They saw it as evil. By the time we get closer to the Civil War, you have people like Alexander Stephens, who would be the vice president. You have John C. Calhoun and many other plantation owners and even preachers, sadly, defending slavery as something good. So they went, it's totally opposite from how the founding fathers had seen it.
That justice and self-preservation couldn't sit on the same side of the scale was really opposed to the American idea, and in the end, it would make the Civil War inevitable. But as slavery became more entrenched and as ideas of liberty and political equality were embraced by more people, some Southerners began to make the case that slavery wasn't just a necessary evil. They argued, for instance, that slaves benefited from slavery because, their masters fed them and clothed them and took care of them in their old age. You still hear this argument today.
And that's a total opposite view of slavery from George Washington, from Thomas Jefferson, from those men. So these southern plantation owners were going the opposite way from what the Declaration of Independence said.
Astonishingly. In fact, you'll probably see asshats in the comments saying that. I will remind you, it's not.
And this is why a lot of these men that ended up forming the Confederacy spoke out against the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence.
Not cursing if you are referring to an actual ass. This paternalism allowed masters to see themselves as benevolent and to contrast their family-oriented slavery with the cold mercenary capitalism of the free labor North. So in the face of rising criticism of slavery, some Southerners began to argue that the institution was actually good for the social order. One of the best-known proponents of this view was John C. Calhoun, who in 1837 said this in a speech on the Senate floor: "I hold that in the present state of civilization, where two races of different origin and distinguished by color and other physical differences, as well as intellectual, are brought together, the relation now existing in the slaveholding states between the two is, instead of an evil, a good, a positive good."
Yeah, so that just goes against most of what that goes against what the founding fathers believed about slavery. So these guys just started just going to the extreme of, not supporting what this country was founded on, which is really sad. A great book to read is Heirs of the Founders, and it goes into a lot of debates between Daniel Webster from Vermont and Massachusetts, and John C. Calhoun, and you can see that struggle, between what is the legacy of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution on slavery. And you'll also see that men like Frederick Douglass took the view that the Constitution was anti-slavery, and that is why a lot of Southerners left the Union, was because they also said that the Constitution was anti-slavery.
Now, of course, John C. Calhoun was a fringe politician, and nobody took his views particularly seriously.
Well, he was Secretary of State from 1844 to 1845.
Well, I mean, who really?
Yeah, he was not. He was a very prominent politician from the South.
Really cares about the Secretary of State, Stan?
He was also Secretary of War from 1817 to 1825.
All right, but we don't even have a Secretary of War anymore.
And he was Vice President from 1825 to 1832.
Oh my God, were we insane? We were, of course, but we justified the insanity with biblical...
Nothing. This was something just for the South. This is where I diverge with the way liberals view history, or people on the left view history. This was not a country, the whole country wasn't on board with slavery. All right? That's why you had abolitionists. That's why you had people, that's why the North was trying to limit slavery and trying to stop slavery from spreading, because they wanted to put an end to it. The North was always working to that end. The South was working to the end of keeping it. It was a battle. It was a struggle. The nation was not united on slavery. So there is no we here. It was divided on political lines. It was divided on geographical lines. There was no we. All right? The whole country was not supportive of slavery.
passages and with the examples of the Greeks and Romans and with outright racism arguing that black people were inherently inferior to whites and that not to keep them in slavery would upset the natural order of things.
So a lot of Southern preachers used a not mistranslation, but misinterpretation of the story of Noah and his sons. And if you read that story, one of his sons, Ham, is supposed to, saw the nakedness of his father, and Noah cursed his son Canaan. Many scholars believe that actually Canaan was the one that probably did the evil against Noah, not Ham. And Ham, according to the Table of Nations, and according to a lot of historical evidence, is said to be the father of Africans, Egyptians, just everybody that's in Africa. And of course, Africans are black. And so they will say, well, the curse, they called it the curse of Ham. And that black people were to serve Japheth and the sons of Japheth and the sons of Shem. However, if you really read that passage in Genesis, it actually says, cursed be Canaan. It doesn't say cursed be Ham. So it's actually the curse of Canaan, not the curse of Ham. So God didn't curse Ham, he cursed Canaan. And Canaan is the people, is the person who inhabited the land of Canaan, which is today modern day Israel. And of course, God eventually used Israel to go into Canaan, and he had them wipe out all the Canaanites. Of course, they didn't obey to the fullest, and Canaanites did survive. But to go back, preachers, Baptists, whatever, in the South would use that, and they call it the curse of Ham. But it was a misinterpretation of that passage, a very gross misinterpretation. Like the words, I mean, didn't they actually read? they must not have had very good reading skills either.
A worldview popularized millennia ago by my nemesis, Aristotle. God, I hate Aristotle. You know what defenders of Aristotle always say? He was the first person to identify dolphins. Well, okay. Dolphin identifier. Yes, that is what he should be remembered for. He's a terrible philosopher. Here's the truth about slavery. It was coerced labor that relied upon intimidation and brutality and dehumanization. And this wasn't just a cultural system, it was a legal one. I mean, Louisiana law proclaimed that a slave owes his master a respect without bounds and an absolute obedience. The signal feature of slaves' lives was work. I mean, conditions and tasks varied, but all slaves labored usually from sunup to sundown and almost always without any pay. Most slaves worked in agriculture on plantations, and conditions were different depending on which crops were grown. Like slaves on the rice plantations of South Carolina had terrible working conditions, but they labored under the task system, which meant that once they had completed their allotted daily work, they would have time to do other things. But lest you imagine this is like how we have work and leisure time, bear in mind that they were owned and treated as property. On cotton plantation, most slaves worked in gangs, usually under the control of an overseer or another slave who was called a driver. This was back-breaking work done in the southern sun and humidity, and so it's not surprising that whippings or the threat of them were often necessary to get slaves to work. It's easy enough to talk about the brutality of slave discipline, but it can be difficult to internalize it. Like, you look at these pictures, but because you've seen them over and over again, they don't have the power they once might have. The pictures can tell a story about cruelty, but they don't necessarily communicate how arbitrary it all was, as, for example, in this story told by a woman who was a slave as a young girl. The overseer went to my father one morning and said, "Bob, I'm going to whip you this morning." Daddy said, "I ain't done nothing." And he said, "I know it. I'm going to whip you to keep you from doing nothing." And he hit him with that cowhide. You know, it would cut the blood out of you with every lick if they hit you hard. That brutality, the whippings, the brandings, the rape, was real, and it was intentional because in order for slavery to function, slaves had to be dehumanized. This enabled slaveholders to rationalize what they were doing, and it was hoped to reduce slaves to the animal property that is implied by the term chattel slavery. So the idea was that slaveholders wouldn't think of their slaves as human, and slaves wouldn't think of themselves as human. But it didn't work. Let's go to the thought bubble. Slaves' resistance to their dehumanization took many forms, but the primary way was by
They actually did a good job there. I went to Mount Vernon, and they had the slave quarters there, and those rooms look like this actually. So that's pretty good attention to detail.
forming families. Family was a refuge for slaves and a source of dignity that masters recognized and sought to stifle. A paternalistic slave owner named Bennett H. Barrow wrote in his Rules for the Highland Plantation, "No rule that I have stated is of more importance than that relating to Negroes marrying outside of the plantation. It creates a feeling of independence." Most slaves did marry, usually for life, and when possible, slaves grew up in two-parent households. Single-parent households were common, though, as a result of one parent being sold. In the Upper South, where the economy was shifting from tobacco to different, less labor-intensive cash crops, the sale of slaves was common. Perhaps 1/3 of slave marriages in states like Virginia were broken up by sale. Religion was also an important part of life in slavery. While masters wanted their slaves to learn the parts of the Bible that talked about being happy in bondage, slave worship tended to focus on the stories of Exodus, where Moses brought the slaves out of bondage, or biblical heroes who overcame great odds like Daniel and David.
That is actually a very neat depiction. You have these white Southern plantation owners using the Bible to enslave them, even if they have to misinterpret the passages or ignore other passages. And then you have the Black Americans the slaves saying, you know what? We see this interpretation of the Bible. We see a lot about freedom, a lot about being free. And I will say this, that these slaves had a way better interpretation of the Bible than these white slave owners.
And although most slaves were forbidden to learn to read and write, many did anyway, and some became preachers. Slave preachers were often very charismatic leaders, and they roused the suspicion of...
And some of these were actually instructed by their slave masters to read, so that then they could learn to read the Bible. However, if you watch, there was a movie not too long ago about the Nate Turner Rebellion, and they would use, he was a preacher and he was taught how to read, but they used him to read the Bible and their interpretation of it, their evil misinterpretation of the Bible. And but eventually, he started to teach a more correct interpretation of the Bible. However, I'm not going to condone his going around and killing, slave owners and things like that. But yeah, that's what I had to say about that.
Of slave owners, and not without reason. Two of the most important slave uprisings in the South were led by preachers. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? We're doing 2 set pieces in a row? All right. The rules here are simple. I wanted to reshoot that, but Stan said no. I guess the author of the mystery document. If I am wrong, I get shocked with the shock pen. Since I have been in the Queen's dominions, I have been well contented. Yes, well contented for sure. Man is as God intended he should be. That is, all are born free and equal. This is a wholesome law, not like the Southern laws, which puts man made in the image of God on level with brutes. Oh, what will become of the people, and where will they stand in the day of judgment? Would that the 5th verse of the 3rd chapter of Malachi were written as with a bar of iron and the point of a diamond upon every oppressor's heart, that they might repent of this evil and let the oppressed go free.
Yeah, so that's very good. I bet this is Frederick Douglass. Notice that he used all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence. So I'm going to say that this is Frederick Douglass.
All right. It's definitely a preacher, because only preachers have read Malachi. Probably African-American, probably not so...
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think he was a preacher, Frederick Douglass, but he did read his Bible.
Someone from the South. I'm going to guess that it is Richard Allen, the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Ah, dang it! It's Joseph Taper, and Stan just pointed out to me that I should have known it was Joseph Taper, because it starts out, since I have been in the Queen's dominions. He was in Canada. He escaped slavery to Canada, the Queen's dominions.
See, the reason why I thought it was Frederick Douglass is because he also was in the Queen's dominions, but yeah, he went to England. I don't know if he would have referred to her as the Queen. Well, he would have. Anyways.
All right, Canadians,
got it
I
wrong.
blame you for this, although thank you for abolishing slavery decades before we did. So the mystery document shows one of the primary ways that slaves resisted their oppression by running away. Although some slaves, like Joseph Taper, escaped slavery for good by running away to northern free states or even to Canada, where they wouldn't have to worry about fugitive slave laws, even more slaves ran away temporarily, hiding out in the woods or the swamps and eventually returning. No one knows exactly how many slaves escaped to freedom, but the best estimate is that 1,000 or so a year made the journey northward. Most fugitive slaves were young men, but the most famous runaway has been hanging out behind me all day long, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman escaped to Philadelphia at the age of 29, and over the course of her life, she made about 20 trips back to Maryland to help friends and relatives make the journey north on the Underground Railroad. But a more dramatic form of resistance to slavery was actual armed rebellion, which was attempted. Now, individuals sometimes took matters into their own hands and beat or even killed their white overseers or masters, like Bob, the guy who received the arbitrary beating.
I'm going to say this. I actually am in favor of replacing Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, whoever you want, with Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill. For many reasons. One, slave owner. So Thomas Jefferson slavery is wrong, no matter what. But Thomas Jefferson was humane in how he treated his slaves. He actually would never before he would beat a slave, he would hold a trial of that slave. And the trial would be, the judge would be one of the slaves, the jury would be the slaves, and things like that. So he would never beat, and I learned this not too long ago from I read it somewhere. But anyway, he wouldn't beat his slaves unless he went through trial and was found guilty. So, but Jackson was totally different. He was that cruel slave owner whipping people for no reason. He was just cruel, really inhumane toward slaves and did not see them as people or anything else. And so that's why I would oppose him for that. Also, he was just a very degenerate type of a human being, and he was a Democrat. And most of his politics I just am not a favor of. The only thing I would have been in favor of was his stance on the National Bank and preserving the Union. But besides that, his politics just wasn't my thing.
Responded to it by killing his overseer with a hoe. But that said, large-scale slave uprisings.
Yeah, see, I'm not in favor of murder either. Not in favor of murder.
Things were relatively rare. The four most famous ones all took place in a 35-year period at the beginning of the 19th century. Gabriel's Rebellion in 1800, which we...
For instance, John Brown, he led an uprising, and his uprising at the Harper's Ferry part of it, I'm more inclined to be in favor of, because they seized weapons and they were fighting against a government that was for slavery. And especially James Buchanan's presidency was very pro-slavery. But what John Brown did in Missouri, where he just outright murdered people who were sleeping, is wrong. And that is something I don't condone. And if these uprisings hadn't just murdered people in cold blood, then I would be more in favor of them. But a lot of times these uprisings kill people in cold blood, and that is never right to do. The American Revolution, or the American War for Independence, wasn't about just killing people in cold blood. No, it was two armies facing off in battle, and prisoners of war and all that. So,
talked about before, was discovered before he was able to carry out his plot. Then in 1811, a group of slaves upriver from New Orleans seized cane knives and guns and marched on the city before militia stopped them. And in 1822, Denmark Vesey, a former slave who had purchased his freedom, may have organized a plot to destroy Charleston, South Carolina. I say may have because the evidence against him is disputed and comes from a trial that was not fair. But regardless, the end result of that trial is that he was executed, as were 34 slaves. But the most successful slave rebellion, at least in the sense that they actually killed killed some people was Nat Turner's in August 18.
And also I wouldn't be in favor for just killing people. Well, I mean, it does depend on what they did. You know, if it was murder like we're seeing here, if it really was murder, then it was wrong. All right. Murder should not be condoned.
31. Turner was a preacher, and with a group of about 80 slaves, he marched from farm to farm in Southampton County, Virginia, killing the inhabitants, most of whom were women and children.
Murder.
Because the men were attending a religious revival meeting in North Carolina. Turner and 17 other rebels were captured and executed, but not before they struck terror into the hearts of whites all across the American South. Virginia's response was to make slavery worse, passing even harsher laws that forbade slaves.
So just imagine if they would have just risen up and not killed women and children. Maybe harsher laws would not have come to pass. Both sides have to take responsibility for certain actions.
From preaching and prohibited teaching them to read. Other slave states followed Virginia's lead, and by the 1830s, slavery had grown, if anything, more harsh. So this shows that large-scale armed resistance was, Django Unchained aside, not just suicide.
But it wasn't just armed resistance. They were killing women and children. It's murder. Murder. All right? It's one thing if it's armed resistance. It's another thing if it's murder. And I hope my viewers understand that.
Suicidal, but also a threat to loved ones and really to all slaves. But it is hugely important to emphasize that slaves did resist their oppression. Sometimes this meant taking up arms, but usually it meant more subtle forms of resistance, like intentional work slowdowns or sabotaging equipment or pretending not to understand instructions. And most importantly, in the face of systematic legal and cultural degradation, they reaffirmed their humanity through family and through faith. Why is this so important? Because too often in America, we still talk about slaves as if they failed to rise up, when in fact, rising up would not have made life better for them or for their families. The truth is, sometimes carving out an identity as a human being in a social order that is constantly seeking to dehumanize you is the most powerful form of resistance. Refusing to become the chattel that their masters believed them to be is what made slavery untenable and the Civil War inevitable. So make no mistake, slaves fought back, and in the end, they won. I'll see you next week.
And
Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. The scripts
I'm okay with them fighting back. I'm just not okay when they murdered. All right? I want to make that distinction clear. So, this was a good video. Of course, I condemn slavery totally, 100%. I'm glad we fought to end slavery. I wish we didn't have to go to war over slavery. It would have been nicer to just have passed an amendment without all of that. Without, 600,000 Americans dying, but it didn't happen that way. So, slavery, chattel slavery is over. Now people may say, well, what about prison slavery? What about, listen, I'm going to be honest. I'm for prison slavery. I'm not for targeting a certain racial group for prison slavery, but I am for prison slavery. I'm for debtors slavery. If you're in debt, you shouldn't just declare bankruptcy and escape. All right? You should have to work off your debt. And if it has to be for 7 years to work off your debt, then do it. Work off your debt, get paid, and then move on. And so that form of slavery I would agree with, but not chattel slavery. Chattel slavery is kidnapping people and selling them, and that is never right to do. So, I'll leave it at that. If you disagree, leave it in the comments below. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you in another video. Thanks for watching.